Welcome back to yet another edition of the I Prefer the 80s and 90s Sports podcast/editorial, where I, Richard Harris Jr., talk about why I prefer the sports of today to yesterday. Today's topic, I'm going to score one for today. In some ways, most ways, possibly in all ways, I don't know. See how I feel as we go. And I shall explain. The one thing that the 80s and 90s should be ashamed of is its treatment and the evolution of women's athletics. The things that women's sports have gone through just to get a little publicity in sports has been crazy. The 80s and 90s, in particular the 80s, there were some insanely amazing, great athletes who would probably, for lack of a better phrase, wish they were born today or wish they were born 20 years ago because of all the advancements of women's sports that are still far behind, but way better than what it was. I mean, we never got to see Ann Myers play professional basketball. Cheryl Miller play professional basketball. We never get to see the track and field stars like we do today. They're on TV, it seems, every few weeks with different events around the country and world. We didn't get to really see the women boxers until the late 90s, and we'll get into that in a minute. But sports in women's athletics was quite quiet, but it wasn't quiet because women's sports have always been good. When I was at the University of Massachusetts, the women's sports were better, way better than the men. Our soccer team was way better than the men's soccer team. Our basketball team was probably about the same, but the women's basketball team enjoyed a little bit of success before the men's. My point simply is that the 80s slightly opened the door as opposed to the door being opened more today. And obviously, the biggest beneficiary of it has been the women's soccer program. Forced the sports world to recognize them once we won the World Cup here in our country. Women's basketball has always been dominant. Women's volleyball has always been dominant. Women's softball has always been dominant. Because a lot of the countries around the world didn't play the sports to our knowledge. I think it's funny that last phrase, to our knowledge. But yet our women go to other countries and get paid way more money to play sports in other countries than they do in our country. The only sport that women's sports in the 80s and 90s that did not really have much of a change in is tennis. And women's tennis changed in this country only because of the Williams sisters, because of Lindsay Davenport and Jennifer Capriati. But for the most part, European tennis players dominated our airwaves. We were lucky to see Chris Evert play and Tracy Austin play. But they were sort of towards the end of their career, and Tracy had a lot of injuries and didn't really fulfill all of her talents. Lori McNeil or Chanda Rubin or her name is escaping my mind right now. It'll come to me as I keep talking. We didn't really get to see. We saw them on TV. We saw them grow into adults. Zena Garrison, thank you. We got to see them grow into being better athletes, but then they wanted to become mothers and they decided to give up tennis and pursue other things. But women's tennis in the 80s, 90s was dominated mostly by European players, but at least it was on television. Americans' sports for women really didn't take off until mid to late 90s after the World Cup. So you say, why are you bringing this up today? I'm bringing this up today, and this is why I didn't 100% go all in with the women's sports thing. There are still a couple sports, one in particular, that I think still lags behind the men in this regard. Lately, there have been a lot of women groups, women athletes, trying to get women's sports more on television, trying to get more revenue for women's sports, which they should be. And for some reason, they appear not to have either the right leadership or the right person to make the point clearer or more clearer to the networks. Because the country is split, maybe not 50-50 in terms of there's more women in the world, or there's more men in the world, or there's the same amount in the world. But for some reason, the network television doesn't get that women consume the same products that men do. And there are products that men don't consume, and there are products that women don't consume. But for the most part, the main sponsors on television, in terms of the alcohol, in terms of the cars, in terms of buying insurance and investments, in terms of clothing, apparel, it's, probably pretty much women do a lot more than the men. But for some reason, network television don't see it that way. But the one sport that I personally feel, and maybe I shouldn't say it in this manner, the women should not try to cross over with the men, and that sport is golf. And the reason why I say it in that manner is simple. Golf courses in general have different boxes for everybody to play. There is the professional, there's ones for seniors, there's one for kids, there's one for women. And we understand completely that women hit the ball not as far as men, but some are starting to hit the ball in the 300-yard range, in the 275-yard range. And we respect the fact that they do that, and they do it on their tour. And some women have the desire to want to play with the men. And in 2003, Annika Sorenstam did. She got to play in a tournament with the men using the men's tees, and she shot a decent score. She didn't make the cut, but people believe that if she had more opportunities, that she might have made a cut because she was such a great player. But see, what happened in the 90s is that golf courses had this new vision in mind. And that new vision in mind was they were going to, for lack of a better phrase, tiger-proof courses, where they would make the courses bigger, make the fairways smaller, and try to make it so difficult for players who hit the ball as far as he did succeed. And so now Tiger is 40-something years old, and he's not playing as much these days because of injuries. You don't hear that phrase used that much anymore because a lot of golf courses just basically just follow the lead of other golf courses and just did it naturally and normally. And so the courses are longer, bigger, more difficult to hit the ball into the fairway. Now, some people will say, well, that she played perfectly into the women's advantage because her length isn't so long, so maybe her hitting the ball shorter and getting it into the fairway, it might be more difficult for her to score because she's got to hit a longer iron into the greens. But that's the point of golf. The point of golf is to score. And so if you can't score, then you can't play. And so if you are hovering around the cut every week, that's fine. And if that is your goal in life to hover, that's fine. But I always thought the goal in life was to win. You play to win the games. You play to win the tournaments. And so when Annika did it, Annika was the best player, female, in the world. And it was experimental because a young girl by the name of Michelle Wie, that was her lifetime dream. She wanted to play, and got a chance to play on the men's tour for an event. And she held her own. Michelle Wie hit the ball longer than most females. And so she felt that she had the tools to compete. But what offended men golfers was that when she played on the men's tour, it bothered them because she didn't have Annika Sorenstam's credentials. Annika Sorenstam she was the best player in the world. She was major champion, multiple, and she was clearly credible amongst the men. Most people thought Michelle Wie was doing it for publicity, and she hadn't earned the right because she hadn't won nothing at that time. And as a 14-year-old, a 15-year-old, and a 16-year-old, and she used to always talk about doing it, it got annoying because people were like, about win some tournaments on the ladies tour. Make the customers want to see you play against the men. And that has always been the beef with men golfers and women's golfers. Make the men's fan base want to see you play. Make the golf fan base want to see you compete against the men. And I'm not saying that women golfers can't be better than men golfers. I've told the story many times. First of all, I've never played golf. Well, once I did, if you call it that. And I'll never say that women can't be better than men at anything. I grew up in a neighborhood with a young lady by the name of Michelle Means, and Michelle was better than me in a lot of things. And I'm not stupid enough to grow up in a household with 3 sisters and a mother and think that women aren't equal to men in a lot of things. But the difference between us and the sports world is not only talent based, but it's also crowd based. I go to Sparks games here in LA, and when it's only $3 a game, that's an insult to women's sports. That's an absolute insult that a professional sport that still not every woman can play, or even every man can play, is charging you $3 to go watch the game. That's a disgrace. And the WNBA and the NBA should be ashamed of that. But the fact of the matter is, I support all sports. I watch everything. I watch LPGA. I watch women's tennis, track and field. I watch everything. My ex-wife used to think I used to watch sports because of the sexual nature of it. And you'd be like, and in my mind, I'm thinking, I didn't even realize that some of these ladies were even sexy. But I like watching sports, period. But my point that I was trying to make earlier is that somebody needs to make people see that there is a need for women's sports more on television other than basketball. But my problem is by having women play in a men's golf tournament is not one of them. Because the person doing it is not the right person to do it. Number one, Lexi Thompson is a lovely golfer. She is American. She is popular. She's had a lot of weird stuff happen in her career where one week she was the sob story of the weekend because she got ripped off on a penalty stroke that cost her a tournament. She was leading a major championship for most of the tournament. I believe it was the U.S. Open. And unfortunately fell apart on Sunday and lost the tournament. I mean, she's in commercials, but the reality is she, in my opinion, isn't the right person to be doing it. And I think a lot of people feel that way because it feels more of a publicity stunt instead of someone actually trying to see where she stands in the world. She has played with men before. There's an event they have every year where it's PGA, the LPGA, and the Senior Tour. They play in Vegas, I believe, and it's a tournament. Or there have been other tournaments where it's been men and women played together, and she's played. And so we've seen her play with the men before. Her doing it this weekend, 20 years after Annika, years after Michelle Wie, is going to register nothing on the Richter scale of sports because she's not Annika Sorenstam. And I think a lot of people rooted against Michelle Wie when she did it because people were tired of hearing about her wanting to do it, tired of hearing her saying she could do it. And her career, she wasn't really the star that every network said she was going to be. And Chris Berman likes to say that's why you play the games. Well, everyone talked the talk about Michelle Wie, and her career did not pan out the way that it was planned out to be. And other golfers were mad at Michelle Wie too. They were like, I'm better than her. What the hell is she going over there for? And so Lexi is a veteran player. Some people think that there's absolutely no reason for her to be doing this when she hasn't played really well on the women's tour in the last few years. The women's tour has absolutely moved on beyond her. Absolutely moved on beyond her. And that's why I say what I said earlier. I criticized the sports world for the 80s. It was terrible for women. The 90s, it got better. The 2000s, it's gotten better. The 10s to the 20s, it got better. The 20s, it's getting better. But the one thing that we don't need in the sports world, we don't need a cross I don't know, for lack of a better word, but a CrossFit between the sports, because in track and field, we know women can run as well as fast as well as men can. Basketball, the only thing that women don't do as well as men is they don't dunk, they don't jump as high. Soccer, our team appears to be better than the men, but doesn't necessarily mean that individually they're better, but as a team they've performed better. Ladies golf is enjoyable to watch, as is men's golf, but they don't play from the same tees. And I always say, whenever I hear women talk about they should be paid as much as men in sports, I say, well, if you're going to pay them the same as you pay men, then every tournament should have the same rules in tennis. If it's a major, it should be 3 out of 5 for the women, just as it is for men. In basketball, they should use the same men's basketball. Don't use a small basketball. Don't use a small soccer ball. And in golf, play from the men's tees. Then you should be paid as much as men. Then maybe you might get more national television exposure. But until then, I'm not saying stay in your lane. I'm saying until then, let's keep it growing till we get to that point where that can happen. That's all. I don't feel Lexi should play this weekend. I think she should concentrate on her career in the LPGA.